Some time ago in a telephone conversation with another minister, I was challenged regarding the usual Seventh-day Adventist understanding of Azazel, the scapegoat of Leviticus 16. My minister friend suggested one cannot support from the Bible account the notion that the scapegoat represents Satan. He held that the ritual service involving the goat more nearly suggests Christ as the scapegoat, that it more fittingly symbolized him who bore the iniquity of us all. Isaiah 53:4. In agreement with this, one Bible commentator states that in the scapegoat, there seems to be a typical view of Christ who bore away the sins. There are always aspects of our belief structure that we take for granted, and so they lie largely unexamined, especially if they are seen to be less important. This questioning of a part of my accepted theological edifice prompted me to investigate this particular subject. Practically from the beginning of our denomination, Adventist scholars in company with others have agreed that the scapegoat typified Satan. However, among other Christian scholars, there are wide variations of opinion as to its significance. The most serious of objections raised regarding the scapegoat as representing Satan would seem to be that, because the goat bears the sins of the people, Satan would therefore be, in a sense, our savior. In examining the issue, I came to the conclusion that the solution to our problem, whether Christ or Satan is represented by the scapegoat, is found in the ritual of laying on of hands in the sanctuary service. In those rituals, there were only a few situations in which laying on of hands was required. First, laying on of hands during the inauguration of the priestly line. We have Exodus 29, Leviticus 8, Leviticus 9. The first two passages are parallel descriptions of the one-time consecration service for Aaron and his sons for the priesthood, which probably was to be performed at the consecrating of every priest. In connection with that ceremony, a bull and 2 rams were provided. The priests-to-be were to place their hands upon the head of the bull for a sin offering and on the head of the ram for a consecration offering. See Exodus 29, verse 10, verse 19, Leviticus 8, 14, and 22. The laying on of hands in connection with the rite was not a priestly act, for they were not as yet priests. It was simply involved in their priestly inaugural ceremony. Leviticus 9, 7, and 8 makes no mention of laying on of hands on the sacrificial animals, but it is likely that the regular procedure was followed, in which case Aaron would have laid his hands upon the head of the animal specified as a sin offering for himself and his sons. The intent of this was that even though they had just become priests, they were still subject to sinning. As Hebrews 7:27 says, he has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins and then for those of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. For this, the law was a shadow of good things to come instead of the true form of these realities. It can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. These priests who were subject to sinning and needed to make sacrifices as any sinful individual needed to do. In this respect, the sacrifice had the same purpose as a sacrifice offered for sin by a private individual. It seems the service was for the priests as private individuals and not strictly a part of their official duties. 2. Laying on of hands upon the heads of sacrificial animals. As noted above, if a priest sinned personally, he was required to bring a sacrificial animal and lay his hand in confession on its head. In this case, he was acting for himself only. We recognize this as a personal matter, different from his official duties. Also, if the whole nation sinned, the elders of the congregation, not the priest, were to lay their hands on the sacrificial animal, thus representing the nation. Leviticus 4:13-15, which says, if the whole congregation of Israel sins unintentionally and the thing is hidden from the eyes of the assembly, and they do any one of the things that by the Lord's commandments are not to be done, and they realize their guilt when the sin which they have committed becomes known, the assembly shall offer a bull from the herd for a sin offering and bring it in front of the tent of meeting, and the elders of the congregation shall lay their hands on the head of the bull before the Lord. and the bull shall be killed before the Lord. If a ruler or any one of the common people sinned, they were to bring prescribed animals, themselves lay hands upon the animal's head in confession, and personally slay it. The priests then manipulated the blood as in other cases. We see then that in every case of an animal sacrificed for sins, the animal received the confessed sins from the sinner by the laying on of hands personally, both of priests and people, and in the case of the nation, by non-priestly representatives. It was always, in effect, a personal matter. The sinner, not the priest, laid the sins on the sacrifice. When a priest laid hands on the sacrifice, it was as a sinner, not in his capacity as a priest. The deviation from this is highly meaningful when we come to the scapegoat. The laying on of hands on the Day of Atonement. The rituals of the day were to begin with the high priest bringing a young bull as a sin offering and a ram as a burnt offering. See Leviticus 16:3. The bull was to be a sin offering for himself and for his house, which would include the other priests. Gerard Hassel observes that the language is identical with the private sin offering mentioned in Leviticus 4. This supports our belief that, although the priest laid his hand upon the head of the bull, he was, in essence, confessing private sins as an individual, not at the moment in his capacity as a priest. The act would therefore not apply in an official and corporate sense. The sacrifice was for himself and his house. Meanwhile, 2 goats had been chosen, one for the Lord, or Yahweh, the other for the scapegoat, verse 8. At that point, the Lord's goat was sacrificed. And here we observe that Hassel notes the curious fact that there is no mention either of laying on of hands or confession of sin over the goat for the sin offering. We suspect it is not mentioned because it was probably not done. If it was not, the omission was consonant with the suggestion that, except in the case of the scapegoat, the high priest, in his official capacity, never laid a hand on a blood sacrifice in the confession of sin. If our premise is correct, the question arises, why would the officiating high priest never lay hands in confession of a sin sacrifice, on a sin sacrifice? One answer is obvious. The high priest, as with all priests, represented the great high priest, Christ. But Christ was not only the high priest, he was also the sacrifice. Himself the priest, himself the victim. It would then be incongruous for the priest representing Christ to confess sins upon the sacrifice if it also represented Christ. It made perfect sense for the sinner to make that confession, laying his sins on his substitute. Now for the laying on of hands upon the scapegoat. We come now to the scapegoat. By the time this final part of the Day of Atonement ritual had arrived, all blood sacrifices had been made. The Lord's goat had been slain and its blood sprinkled before the mercy seat. This sacrifice atoned for all the sins of the people. This expiation was not inadequate, partial, incomplete, needing any augmentation. It was complete, finished. No supplement, no other sacrifice is required. When he has made an end of atoning for the holy place, the tabernacle of meeting, where the sins of the people were recorded, and the altar, he shall bring the live goat. If a scapegoat represented Christ bearing away finally and for all the sins of his people, we have the incongruous situation referred to above. The high priest was to lay his hands, in this case only, both hands, upon the scapegoat, thus ritually transferring confessed sins to that animal. To make this application to the great antitypical service unfolds in the book of Hebrews. We would have Christ, the high priest, placing believers' sin upon himself, the scapegoat. Not only is this incongruous, we have the further problem of it thus appearing as though the Calvary sacrifice was deficient, that Christ did not there complete his work of expiation, or that some other figure was necessary to illustrate its sufficiency. Hassel states unequivocally that, except for the scapegoat, the high priest did not lay hands on an animal used in this or any other ritual during the 3 days of atonement. This is the only time in the 3 days of the atonement rites that the hands are laid upon an animal. While it is inappropriate to think of Christ placing the believer's sin upon himself, the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all, Isaiah 53:6. It is perfectly acceptable in the light of the symbolism of Leviticus 16 to understand him doing so upon another ultimately responsible being, Satan. All things considered, it is definitely preferable to see the symbolic thrust of Leviticus leading to this conclusion rather than the other. In examining the transferal of sin to the scapegoat, it is significant to note that the goat was not treated as all other animal sacrifices were, slain as atonement for sins. A sacrifice was valid as an atonement for transgression only as it died, as there was spilled blood. Thus, Jesus was set forth to be a propitiation for us by his blood. It is through his blood that we have redemption. Whom God set forth as a propitiation by his blood through faith to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance God had passed over the sins that were previously committed. Romans 3:25. It's through his blood that we have redemption. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses according to the riches of his grace, Ephesians 1:7. Preserving the goat alive tells that Azazel has another significance. Because shed blood was necessary for a sin offering, in what way could an animal kept alive be considered such an offering? In what respect would it represent Christ? To say that the scapegoat, which played a part only after the atonement was complete, represents Christ is to blur the atonement, to suggest it is not sufficient, that something else was needed to complete it and make it effective. Such an idea is not biblical. As noted above, other cases of confessed sins placed on the animal sacrifice were placed by the sinner himself to free him from his guilt. In the case of the scapegoat, it was the high priest, not the sinner, who placed the sins on the goat. The reason for this is that the people's sins had already been cared for by the sacrifice of the Lord's goat. Now the goat for Azazel had its part to play, one quite different from the Lord's goat. We have an example of such a transfer in Leviticus 24. A young man blasphemed God and so was sentenced to be taken outside the camp and stoned to death. Before the stoning, witnesses to his words laid their hands on his head. Two suggestions have been made as to the significance of this act. One, they were making solemn testimony that they had indeed heard his blasphemies and that he therefore merited his fate. Second, they were transferring back to him any guilt that had rubbed off on them by hearing him. Both of these suggestions have merit. Christ, as no other, has been witness to the rebellion of Satan and can attest that he richly deserves his fate. And the sins Satan caused others to commit will be laid back upon him so that he will be required to bear the penalties for those sins. This is not to make him a propitiation for sin. A third suggestion made by Dr. Roy Gain, based on Deuteronomy 19, is that when one maliciously and falsely accuses another for some crime, he himself is to receive the punishment intended for the one falsely accused. Thus, Satan, the accuser of the brethren, receives punishment as a malicious witness. That the scapegoat symbolized Satan is recognized by the biblical expositor. In its substitutionary punishment, it, the scapegoat, symbolized the sending back of sin to its demonic author, and thus the breaking of his claims over God's people. In the day-by-day laying on of hands for the transferal of sins to the animal sin offerings in the sanctuary service, the priest in his official capacity had no part. Such transfers were always done by the guilty party, which, of course, sometimes included the priest as a private individual. Subsequent to the transfer, the offerer killed the animal. The priest then manipulated the blood. In one case only, the transfer of sin to the scapegoat on the Day of Atonement, did the high priest, in his priestly capacity, lay hands upon the animal. This was done after the atonement for sin had been completed. Unlike all other cases following such transfer, the goat was not slain. Rather, it was to be sent away into the wilderness by the hands of a suitable man, who was to release the goat into the wilderness. Leviticus 16, 21, and 22. Seventh-day Adventists find an understanding of this in their view of the investigative judgment and the millennium, which dovetails neatly with the Bible teaching of the typical Day of Atonement. Satan is banished to a destroyed earth at the coming of the Lord for 1,000 years, while all the saints are in heaven. See them coming back at the end of the 1,000 years in the New Jerusalem. And then we see the final judgment of the wicked, where Satan has been banished for 1,000 years, sent into the wilderness. The wilderness, the world that becomes a wilderness at the coming of the Lord, the destruction of the man of sin and those who follow him, and the resurrection of the righteous, and the ascension to heaven to the marriage supper of the Lamb. After the high priest finished his work of reconciliation and emerged from the sanctuary, the rituals involving the scapegoat were performed. When Christ, the great high priest, ends his work in the heavenly sanctuary. Hebrews 8 through 10 demonstrates this, as well as hinted at and explained in its chronology in Daniel 12. At the end of the antitypical Day of Atonement, he places upon Satan responsibility for the sins he has caused God's people to perform. Then, antitypical of the scapegoat being taken into the wilderness, the devil and Satan is bound for 1,000 years and cast into the bottomless pit. The biblical evidence precludes the scapegoat as representing Christ.